You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Happy New Year, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well and ready for the new year and you have lots of fun goals on tap. For myself, I've got another couple big book projects brewing on the burners, and I'm really looking forward to our road cycling trip with the Cyclist Menu in Mallorca, Spain on May 17th through the 22nd. If you have not checked that out yet, there's a link in the show notes. There is just nothing like spending time with like-minded women, just nothing. And of course, I love cycling, so I am definitely looking forward to that. And as part of my training, I will be eating all of the carbohydrates, which is the topic of this week's show as we kick off the new year. Somehow, someway, many midlife and menopausal women are still getting the message that we need to cut carbs. In fact, this week's guest, women's sports dietitian Kristen Arnold, still has clients flat out say, quote unquote, carbs are evil. Even as we are watching athletes around the globe stuffing down as many carbohydrates as humanly possible to supercharge their performance, this attitude that so many of us have towards carbs persists. So this week, we devote the show to all the life and performance boosting benefits of carbohydrates. We cover carbohydrate timing, processed carbs versus unprocessed carbs, carbohydrates' impact on blood sugar, brain function, mood, inflammation, general health, and much more. And I will say, when I do shows like this, I fully understand why so many performance podcasts are like 2 hours long or even longer. But we crammed a bunch in here, and I really do appreciate Kristen for being so generous with her time, which is not a lot. She's got a lot on her plate too, and I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did. One of the big takeaways for me, honestly, is that so many of the negative health consequences that we try to avoid by cutting carbs can actually be the product of cutting carbs, including elevated blood sugar, inflammation, and chronic disease. So eat your carbs, ladies. It really does help with health, body composition, and performance. All right, before we get to it, give us a follow at Feisty Menopause on Instagram and Facebook. Come on in to our still ever-growing Hit Play Not Pause private Facebook group and dive into those show notes and sign up for my free weekly Feisty 40+ newsletter with all the training and nutrition news you can use. Thank you, as always, for the kind reviews and 5-star ratings. I was hoping, I had fingers crossed, to hit 700 ratings by 2026, and we were so close, so thank you. We were just 4 away. So thank you so much. If you like the show, please pass it along to someone who could benefit from it. It really does help us continue to grow in a very crowded podcast space. Very finally, quick thanks to MIDI Health for continuing on as a supporter of the show in 2026. So many of you are getting the care you need through MIDI. I myself use their services and I'm a big fan. So thank you, MIDI, for your continued support. And with that, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right. Kristen, well, I'm going to wish you a happy new year, even though it's not, because you're going to be the first show of the new year for us.
Very exciting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I decided, fueling is such a big deal, and carbohydrates are an evergreen topic, and also there's so much confusion and there's still so much fear that I just let's kick the show off with something about eating, carbohydrates. So we will be the first show of the year, and I've been looking forward to this one because I really appreciate your depth of knowledge. You work with women in this demographic. You are an athlete yourself, so I appreciate you coming on and sharing your time and wisdom with us.
Yeah, Really stoked about it. I also think starting the year off with a topic about fueling and making sure we're supporting not only our health goals, but our performance goals is a perfect way to start.
So, with that said, let's set the stage. There is still, maybe even more so now, I see growing anxiety around carbs in midlife. Women are worried about gaining weight, insulin resistance, blood sugar spikes, elevations, especially with more people using CGMs, which I'm not saying is necessarily a bad thing, but you need to know what you're looking at. So when you work with active women in their 40s and 50s, are you also seeing some of these concerns?
Yep, all the time. Unfortunately, I even recently have heard things like carbs are evil.
Oh,
I
Jesus.
try to cut down carbs. I was trying to stay away from carbs. Carbs are bad. And the carbs are evil. Yes, that's what I heard recently. And I was struck, even though I know that's how they feel about them right now.
And what do you say?
At that point, when I'm talking to anyone about carbohydrates, first off, we're talking about carbohydrates are a nutrient, right? They are a nutrient that our body needs for not only survival, but also quality of life, brain function, mental health, some of these other factors that people don't necessarily associate with them, right? Like our brains, their preferred fuel source is glucose. Whether our bodies have to make them because we're not eating enough carbs or we're getting them through food, this is the body's one of their preferred sources of energy and fuel. And it is at its core, it's a nutrient, not something that we want to stay away from.
Thank you for that. So that said, do carbohydrate needs shift in perimenopause and postmenopause?
Somewhat. So when I'm working with a peri or postmenopausal athlete, so that specifically someone that's physically active, they don't need to be training for something or following a really strict plan, but they need to be engaging in some kind of regular physical activity. So with that being said, actually a lot of the recommendations are the same, but there is a big emphasis in even more importance on the timing of the carbohydrates. So the key here is the amount of carbs in the day don't necessarily change based on your age, but the timing becomes super important to make sure that we are getting the majority of the carbs that we're taking in before, during, and after any kind of physical activity.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Why is that timing shift happening?
So in perimenopause, one of the things that's happening is we're having these spikes and dips of estrogen levels. And so when we have the dips, that is leading to more insulin resistance, meaning the body isn't processing carbs in the same way.
Right.
So when we're exercising, there are different metabolic pathways, there's different transporters that are using carbs. So we want to take advantage of what I call the metabolic window when we're exercising in order to have those carbs go to things like glycogen for performance, even used for brain activity. So that window is even more important in perimenopause, and then also the same in postmenopause when we have low levels of estrogen, compared to somebody that's premenopausal and has regular levels of estrogen that are fluctuating just with the menstrual cycle. When we get in these periods of time where we may become somewhat more metabolically inflexible, having carbs around that training window or metabolic window is really important.
Gotcha. And that's important. What I'm hearing is that's important not only for health, but also for the performance that you're talking about, right?
Yes, exactly. So at its core, when we're fueling around our training, we are going to improve or increase our potential during that training session or during that activity. So we're going to be able to put out more watts on the bike or feel stronger, do higher intensity at lower heart rate in a run, push more weight potentially. So the better we can improve our performance in our training, the better we will improve things like body composition, our body's ability to use carbs and fat. We're also going to support our mental acuity. So there's a bunch of benefits to having carbs in this window. Like you said, for both health, decreasing things like inflammation, but also performance and ultimately other factors that go along with that.
And when you're talking about having them around your session, like before, during, and after, why is that after piece important?
The afters is still within that metabolic window when we are using different enzymes, different transporters. Insulin is doing something different. So there's a common, I think I've seen this quite a few times recently, where people are starting to recommend like walking before and after a meal.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of that is to create like a mini metabolic window.
Right.
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 So if we're people that exercise and do physical activity, that's the same thing. But again, that after piece is not only taking advantage of utilizing carbs for beneficial purposes for our metabolism, but also things like glycogen replenishment, which is going to help us perform in the next training session and recover more quickly.
It's so interesting that you talk about that little creating a mini window, because I hadn't really thought about it that way. But when I did some experiments with a CGM, and I was honestly pretty blown away about the power of an after meal walk and what it did to blood sugar response. I just kept thinking, this is why traditional cultures always took a walk after their big meal, right? They went for a walk in the evening. It's amazing what it does for your blood sugar.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think your mental health as well. I
Mm-hmm.
think having that time, and it can help with digestion as well. And there's other benefits too. But yes, we're creating that metabolic window, that window of time when our body is utilizing carbs differently than when we're taking in those same carbs at rest.
So I want to talk about the amounts, but I think maybe I'll put a pin in that, and we'll talk about the amounts when we talk about how high people are going with their carbohydrates. So we'll wait on that just a second. While we're talking about eating carbohydrates in general, is there an amount that, or a proportion, or something that you give women sort of as a baseline that they should be thinking about for their carbohydrate intake?
Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at how many carbs to intake, first off, it really depends on the person that I'm talking to in that moment. If I'm able to personalize it, then we will design different amounts of carbs for different types of training days that's specific to them. So if I'm giving a general recommendation to the general audience
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
way, if you are in a training period where you're training 3, maybe 5 days per week for about an hour, then your carbohydrate needs might be 3 to 5 grams of carb per kilogram body weight. So it's based on your body weight.
Okay.
And 3 to 5 grams of carb for a 140-pound athlete could be something like 250 to 350 grams of carb in the day.
Yep.
If we're talking about somebody that's exercising between 7 and 10 hours a week, so that's 1 to 2 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week, then that would be around 5 to 7 grams of carb per kilogram body weight, which is around 350 to 450 grams of carb.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes up from there. I don't even want to talk about what the numbers are because it scares some people. So
I understand. So does that number include their training session and what they're doing in the training session itself?
yes, that does include in the training session.
Okay, perfect. And I know some coaches, and I've had some coaches recommend to me like a periodization of carbs, eating more when you need more, fewer when you need fewer. And that made sense to me on paper, but it never worked for me in practice because I'm hungry on those days where I'm not doing as much. So I don't know if that means that I'm not eating enough during my session, or I just am in compensation mode and I need that food. Do you have thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. And I would tell anyone listening to this podcast, when people say periodization, they mean different things.
Okay.
So if they're not defining what they mean by periodization, you really got to be more discretionary with what they're telling you, because some people will talk about periodization in terms of months, right? Like this is their this is their out of season training. They're periodizing that way. Sometimes they're higher training loads. I think, Celine, what you're talking about was periodization is like per day.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so I just want to say that because I think it's a hot topic right now, but I've heard it defined in so many different contexts.
Gotcha.
But the way Celine's describing it is how I describe it as well. So
okay.
As far as what I would define it, yes, we're on the same page. So I call them Hungry Mondays. They're really common.
Thank you.
Yes, Hungry Mondays are a cultural phenomenon. It's a physiological experience a lot of endurance athletes experience. And one of the main reasons is because when we are exercising at such high training volumes or amounts, I mean, our needs can be 2,700, 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 calories a day. And it's just really, really difficult and logistically challenging to get those needs met. And you can very unintentionally be under by up to 1,000 calories a day. Yeah. Right. So it is not intuitive for most people to meet their energy needs on high volume training days. It's just not. It's like our stomachs, our intestines, blood flow comes out of the gut into our limbs in order to do the exercise. And that will temporarily shut down digestion. So when we're doing high volume training, our bodies are not telling us that we're hungry. Right. They're telling us that we need to do this activity. So then we get to a rest day, and all of a sudden our rest and digest hormones are released. And now all of a sudden we're super hungry, even though we're not doing the high volume training. So most of the time it's because we're in an energy hole or an energy deficit coming out of high volume training days. And so our bodies need to refuel on those recovery days. But it also can be a cue that maybe we need to find more creative ways to eat more on our higher volume training days.
Yeah. But it is, am I hearing that I should heed those hunger signals on my Hungry Monday?
Yes. If they're there, that is always a reason to make sure you are eating.
Okay.
Quality is still important, but ultimately the calories and the energy your body needs to recover is the most important piece.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about, while we're talking about numbers and what people are taking in during, I'm sure you are immersed in the high carb revolution right now that is happening. We are seeing, Kristen, we're seeing bananas, literally like bananas numbers. Like David Roche hitting 120 to 140, Cam Worth 200 grams per hour on the bike course. I haven't seen pro women, and maybe I've missed it, hitting numbers quite in those stratospheric ranges. But what's the message for us here in this audience as far as what we should be thinking about with our carb intake during endurance exercise?
Yeah, I think in general, when we're reading articles or listening to podcasts or following some of our favorite athletes, a lot of the time, those athletes or performance teams are doing cutting edge research behind the scenes to see like what is the next best thing. So they may be behind, or they may be ahead of where the research is, but also these elite athletes are, like genetic specimens of humans.
Right.
And so when we're talking about somebody like David Roche, he could be burning 800, 1,000, 1,200 calories per hour during a run or a race, where somebody that's a more recreational runner, or even like a pretty strong runner, but more in like the amateur category, they might only be burning 600, 800 calories.
Right.
So that's like 30 to 40% higher. So first of all, his needs are going to be higher than somebody that is not focused on professional running. So first we have to think about it in context of like, okay, who is this person? What are their needs? What are their goals? Do we actually need all that? And then thinking about the context of the events that they're competing in. So if they're doing something that is longer duration or multi-day, primarily multi-day, that's where we see these really high carb per hour intakes actually benefiting the athletes. So most of the research that we've seen so far, it doesn't necessarily support super high carb intake for one-day events. Unless they're really long duration, like an Ironman or even a half Ironman. So if the events are so long that they are then complete, like there's no way for them to not run out of glycogen, then yes, pushing 120 higher carbs per hour makes sense. But if they're doing a shorter event that's one day, they may be doing it, but that doesn't mean it's doing anything for them.
Right,
So,
right. We do have quite a few half and full Ironman athletes in ultra runners. Should they all be trying to go as high as they can, or where do you guide them? Because I don't think I could ever get to those numbers, honestly.
No. So general guidelines I use are for lower moderate duration training. So something 2.5 hours or less, like 1.5 to 2.5, maybe 3 hours. The recommendation is 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we get above 3 hours, that's the mark when we will likely be running out of glycogen. So we need to push to 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour.
Okay.
I would say if you are not burning at least 800 calories an hour according to a wearable or a power meter, then going above 90 grams doesn't really make sense. It's not logical. So it's for athletes that are burning these really high amounts of kilojoules or calories during exercise, and their events are over 5 hours, which, yes, Ironman, half Ironman, it would bring context. But that will definitely require gut training in order to reach above 90 or even 290 for some athletes.
Even 290, yeah. And that is really just saying you need to do that while you're training when you talk about gut. Yes. And is there I used to just try to ballpark replacing 50 to 60% of what I was burning per hour. Does that make sense? So if I'm burning 600 calories an hour on my bike, I would try to make sure I was eating like 300 calories an hour if I could.
Yep. Yeah. That is a really good recommendation, a good ballpark to be in.
Yeah. And that seemed to work for me, because if I'm sitting there trying to just do grams, I'm going to, it's not mentally and mathematically, it's not going to really work for me. But if I can look at like, okay, this is what I typically burn, this is what I want to be putting in about an hour, it seems to work best mentally and honestly physiologically, for me personally.
Yep.
Then let's talk a little bit what you would recommend before something very long.
Yep. So before exercise, there's a very broad recommendation of carbs depending on how much time you have. So the recommendation is 1 to 4 grams of carb per kilogram body weight, 1 to 4 hours before exercise, right? So that can range from like 60 grams of carb up to 240 grams of carb for somebody that's around 60 kilograms. And so that's a huge difference. But it's modulated depending on how much time you have. So if you're waking up at 5 and you're training at 5:45, obviously you're not going to try to eat 200 grams of carb because it's going to like not go well.
Right.
But if you have more time, then you're able to have more time to digest and therefore can take in more carbs. So I think in a perfect world, when I'm working with an athlete, if they are, depending on what type of event they're doing and how much time they have between waking up and starting their event, I usually try to get at least 2 grams of carb per kilogram body weight in them about 2 hours before. So for somebody that's 60 kilograms, that's going to be 120 grams of carb 2 hours before.
Okay. And what is the role of that that carbohydrate consumption beforehand. Before I hit record, we were talking about that study that's sort of circulating right now about, is it really putting your glycogen back, or is it just raising your blood sugar levels? Like, what is the purpose of that pre-event, pre-workout meal that you're having there?
Mm-hmm. So pre-exercise meal is topping off glycogen stores that may not already be full. So
Okay.
if you are already saturated in your glycogen, having the pre-race meal might not necessarily help you in a shorter event, but it's still going to help to provide that blood glucose levels for an event that's 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours long.
Right, right.
But it ultimately helps to provide that steady stream of blood glucose going into the training session or the race.
And if I am consistently putting in, say I'm doing something that's 3 or 4 hours or even up to 5, if I'm consistently putting in those amounts that we just talked about, am I preventing my glycogen stores from ever like getting tapped out? Is that my ultimate goal? Like to have enough blood sugar and to be like, we don't want to like empty out the stores at any point, correct?
Correct. We
Yeah.
want to maintain optimal carb availability to the
Mm.
bloodstream, to the brain, to the
Mm-hmm.
muscles, to the rest of the body.
And that comes in the form of both, and I guess that's what I'm, and maybe it's minutia we don't need to tease out, but I do sometimes wonder, like, how much I'm just keeping my blood sugar at a sort of stable thing as opposed to, my glycogen stores, though my
Mm-hmm.
body might not recognize the difference.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few processes that are going on metabolically. It also depends on how well trained the person is, how
Mm.
big their glycogen stores are, how well fat adapted they are.
Right.
So, for somebody that is less trained, they are going to get a bigger boost from taking in carbohydrates before and during exercise because their bodies are requiring that glucose because it doesn't have the ability to oxidize fat in muscle tissue as well.
Right.
For somebody that's like really well adapted, trained, been training for years in their sport, it may not produce the same level of benefit unless the event is getting over 4 hours.
Gotcha. And then there are people who, before we leave the before, I've seen talk about sort of a reactive hypoglycemia, like this idea that you want to time your chews or your gels or whatever, that quick carbohydrate you're taking in, so you don't have a little bit of a slip in energy right before you start. Can you talk about that phenomenon a
Mm-hmm.
little bit?
Yeah, I personally really am challenged with this. So
You mean
I've done
personally
a lot.
yourself?
Personally myself in my
Okay.
own athletic pursuits. So yeah. So what can happen is when we have like a dose of carbohydrates, and it's usually in the form of quick carbohydrates, so like a banana or a gel or something, in that 30 to 60 minutes before exercise, what can happen is our blood sugar temporarily rises, and then at the onset of exercise, we have this temporary like drastic dip in our blood glucose levels. It feels awful.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
feels like your legs are full of lead, like you're dizzy, you're on drugs you don't want to be on. Like it is a terrible experience for like 20 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like it's not long, but so yes, we've actually moved away from recommending a snack around 30 to 60 minutes before, and now we're recommending making sure ideally you're having a meal to at least 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours before training, and then not having anything between that meal and starting the training session to avoid that dip.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. And then would you start fueling soon into whatever you're doing? Do you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
instead, okay, yeah. Like
Yep. So
instead of
that'll,
having a gel 15 minutes before 20, whatever, um, just go and then just start your fueling when into how far into the exercise?
yeah. Yeah, and I think within the 30 minutes, so a gel 10 minutes before
Okay.
that before the start is okay because that's essentially considered intra workout fueling.
Okay.
It's that 30 to 60 minutes before that's the issue.
Gotcha.
And if you have to, like, let's say you wake up at 5 and you exercise at 5:45 and you have to take something in. First of all, not everyone experiences this. This is a case by case basis. But also, if you just start taking in a carb drink mix or gummies or a gel like immediately at the onset, you can just keep your blood glucose levels high and totally avoid this anyway.
Right, right. That's what I was driving. Excellent advice, because it's interesting because I know Alan Lim over at Scratch was looking at that and seeing people running into that trouble. Not everybody, like you said, but some people really having that dip right before they start. It's like, we don't want this. Like, that's
No,
not
no,
that's
it's
not what we're
awful.
trying to it's not what we're trying to go for. So let's talk about, I think, is there anything that we didn't cover as far as like the fueling in and around before, during, after? I guess how much should we have after?
Afterwards, the recommendation is 1 gram of carb per kilogram body weight within about 30 minutes post training. So
Okay.
again, the advantage of this is we're taking advantage of this window. So something I work like a lot of the midlife women athletes I work with, they'll have protein, but they won't have carbs after their
Yeah.
training. It's
Yeah.
super common.
Yep.
And then I'm like, okay, well, you need to eat 60 or 65 or 70 grams of carb, which is like 2+ bananas. They're like, what? But again, we're taking advantage of this window. So metabolically, it's more beneficial to have these carbs right after training than it is to have like a giant pasta meal at night, depending on the context of your week.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of
So
sense.
yeah, we definitely want to and need to take in carbs, not only for glycogen replenishment for continued performance, but also taking advantage of that metabolic window.
So what we're talking about midlife women, and we talked a bit about this before we hit record, and I think part of this is the fear of carbs that happens at this time, is that women hit perimenopause, the menopause transition, and all of a sudden they're seeing their fasting glucose is going up, their A1C numbers are higher. And I've done whole shows on this, so we don't need to dwell on this topic, but I'm curious what your thoughts on it, that if it's something that you see. I mean, I also see for myself, and I just saw this, I just tested with Eternal, and I was undershooting my carbs again. And that actually has this effect of raising those numbers, of making my blood sugar higher. And can you speak to that whole phenomenon, please?
hmm So, with regards to like entering midlife and talking about, what is glucose doing? What are our beta cells doing? What's insulin doing? So, yeah, insulin, I'll say like a lot of it's just, I think for our culture, we have so many ingrained things. It's just not intuitive necessarily to eat the amount of carbs we need, even if we didn't have these kind of, preconceived notions about them. But getting blood work done and working with somebody to see what are the recommendations and how do I actually get there is so valuable because it's just not ingrained in us in the same way.
Yeah, I agree.
But things that I'm seeing, so when we are endurance athletes, and we unintentionally or intentionally underfuel with carbs, this can and does create a stress response in the body. So it elevates cortisol levels, it elevates even things like CRP, which is a more chronic inflammatory marker. Adrenaline is in there. And so when this happens, our bodies are upregulating glucose production. And so this can make fasting glucose look higher, but it's not in context that our insulin sensitivity isn't there or our beta cells are dysfunctioning. It's just in context of like our body is in this stress response, so it thinks it needs glucose specifically for the brain. So it has nothing to do with like our potential for having something like diabetes and everything to do with just metabolically how we're adapting to the diet and to the exercise we're doing.
That's interesting because and that's why we when I say we, I mean the people I was working with at Eternal were saying like all the other parameters look good. The insulin looked good, everything else. Like it really does look like you are not eating enough carbohydrate to support everything you're doing. And they were right, and it's often unintentional. I eat a lot of high fiber whole foods, and sometimes I'm just not getting enough food because I'm full.
Yep.
Which kind of brings us into, and I was going to talk about it later, but it's a good time to talk about it perhaps now, is the role of ultra processed, all these foods get really bad raps and we're told not to eat them, but it can be hard to get all the carbs I need from Brussels sprouts.
Yeah. That sounds like a gut bomb right there.
Yeah, right.
So, yes, we know that foods like whole foods that come out of the ground or out of the animal, there are specific compounds in those foods that regulate like hormone and fullness responses in our body. So when we eat like 100 calories worth of Brussels sprouts, that is going to elicit a different response than if we eat 100 calories of cupcake.
Yes, 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 it will.
Yeah. And so I think one important message for this podcast with ultra processed foods is most of the studies that are done on the impacts of ultra processed foods on health are from chronic, like studies that are done over time with eating patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So what percentage of their daily calorie intake is coming from ultra processed foods? How many of them are they including in a day, a week, a month? It's really not about having like potato chips, a bag of potato chips on a ride, once a week. It's more about are potato chips a snack that you're having every single day, when you're done with work. So we do know that like some of the ingredients, some of the compounds in these ultra processed foods can impact our fullness to hunger cues and levels, but it's more in context of like how many of these foods are you eating on a chronic basis, not one at a time. And I would argue, based on like my practice and what I've seen in things like blood tests with Eternal and other companies I've worked for, is that underfueling total number of calories or underfueling specifically just with carbs, these have a greater impact on your long-term health more than quality can. If we're significantly or severely under in carb availability or calorie or energy availability, this has greater impacts than the quality of our food.
And when you're talking about that, you're talking bone health as well as metabolic health. Yeah.
Let's go, if we're looking at, systemic health or chronic disease risk, we're looking at cardiovascular disease, we're looking at diabetes, we're looking at cancer risk. So anything to do with inflammation, right? Those are all inflammatory based diseases. And then also things like bone health, absolutely, which is one of the ones that are more, midlife women are more prone to compared to other populations. And so having low energy availability, one of the primary negative outcomes is low bone density. And that can lead to osteopenia, osteoporosis. And so this is not only going to impact our health, but also our quality of life. We're just not going to have as much mobility.
So if we want to talk about briefly just what are some because there's definitely we're a spectrum between Brussels sprouts and cupcakes, right? So I would say I just started intentionally eating more potatoes and eating more, foods that are not super ultra processed, more pasta, even more things that around my training that will give me more carb density than some of the high fiber foods that I was eating, and fill those needs. And I'll say it definitely, you mentioned cortisol. I feel less stressed when I am eating appropriately like that. And I've heard from people in my audience that they sleep better when they are hitting their numbers.
Yep. So when I'm working with someone and we identify that they're severely under eating carbs, like I said, a lot of the time this is not intentional. They're eating steel cut oats for breakfast. They're eating a salad with beans for lunch. They're having like a sweet potato at dinner.
Are you in my house? Is there a camera? I could just describe my life. Go ahead.
I mean, it's gorgeous food. Gorgeous.
It is gorgeous.
Yeah. It's gorgeous. It tastes good. You have these like nice senses of fullness. You feel like, yeah. So all these foods have an incredible amount of nutrient density, meaning like vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, these nutrients that our body needs. But you're right, it doesn't necessarily have the carb density. So some of the easiest foods to add carb density that still have nutrients, like you mentioned, potatoes are one of the ones I recommend the most often. Japanese yams, like the purple outside and the white inside, have more carbs compared to like a sweet potato. Even incorporating things like quick oats or old-fashioned oats instead of steel-cut oats on a day when you're training and you need more carb availability. And also the main tip is varying or adding variety to the amount of carbs at a meal. So that would look like having rice with beans with sweet potatoes, or yep, or like juice with oats with honey with fruit at breakfast.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You wrote something when we're talking about carbs and women. While you were talking, it occurred to me that I saw something that you posted on Instagram about PMS and carb cravings, and I just wanted to touch on that a little bit because I think we sometimes don't read our cues and don't listen to our cues, and that's part of my issue with carbs, I think. But talk a little bit about that, like if you're having carb cravings around PMS for women who are still getting their cycle, what is the biology there?
So when we are premenstrual, one of the main things that's happening is it raises our core body temperature. So if you were to take your temperature, like you're, in the morning with the thermometer every day, when you are premenstrual, it will significantly go up. It's very obvious, in my opinion. I've done this. I use like an ovulation thermometer just to experiment and have, see what it looked like. And it would be, a whole point higher in the 5 to 10 days before I would start menstruating. So when our core body temperature is higher, that increases our overall energy expenditure for the day, our resting metabolic rate. So that translates to our body needs more calories just to survive in that time period. On top of that, there are other hormonal processes that are not allowing us to have as easy access to carbohydrates for fuel. So this is our brain being like, where are the carbs? Where are the carbs? So I think that is another theory as to why it may trigger a response in us to say that we want carbs in that moment.
That's interesting. That is very interesting. And again, I think tuning into yourself is always because the take home is it is okay to eat more in that time, as what I'm hearing.
Yes. And I think distinguishing, like, would I be as satisfied with a piece of chocolate as I would like a bowl of cereal or a sweet potato? Are we hungry? Like, do we need food in that moment, or are we having like an emotional response? And most of the time it's that we just need food and we'll feel better.
Sometimes you need a piece of chocolate, Kristen.
You absolutely need pieces of chocolate sometimes. There's nothing wrong with chocolate, really. Yeah. That's how I feel about it. a lot of the time, if it's a specific food like that, it can be either like an emotional response, but it can also be that our bodies, our brains need that quick fuel source, and we associate the chocolate with a quick fuel source. So in that way, like meeting that body's needs is not only important for your health, but also your quality of life and your performance ultimately, just making sure that you're staying well fueled.
Yep. So speaking of metabolism and needs, I do hear sometimes that women are worried that if they eat carbs, they won't burn fat. Can you talk a little bit about the metabolic flexibility and that how that actually works, especially with regards to exercise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think for a long time there was the narrative that was pushed that we need to not have eaten carbs and we do low intensity exercise in order to burn fat, right? Like
Right.
when we're doing a walk or a easy run or an easy bike ride, that's our fat burning zone. Like that's the messages that we got for a long time. What we actually know is that when we're talking about fat burning, it has more to do with your overall metabolic rate for the day than it does the specific exercise that you're doing. So in that way, something like a sprint workout or a HIIT training session, these workouts, even though they are very high intensity, they're intentionally very high intensity, all out efforts, and they're shorter. You can only do these workouts for like 20 or 30 minutes sometimes. These will increase the body's metabolic rate for the rest of the day,
Right.
which ultimately will lead to more fat burning.
Right.
So in order to do these workouts, we also need to have carbs in us. We need to have carbs available to do them.
And what do we need? Because when you go to, and I don't know if this is still the case because it's been a while since I've been at a CrossFit gym, but there was, and I think still is, a tendency for people in that space to eschew carbs, to be very protein focused and not really eat as many carbs. Can you talk about the role of carbs in that environment where you're doing more resistance training, sprint training, and all of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when CrossFit came on the scene, now it's High Rocks, apparently. High Rocks is
Now
all
it is definitely High Rocks.
range,
Yeah.
which does include more endurance exercise than traditional CrossFit. But there was an emphasis on the paleo diet, right?
Yes, very much
And
so.
in my opinion, the paleo diet is more about the food quality than it is the actual like ratio of carbs to protein to fat. So a lot of people miss the message that, yeah, you still need to eat a lot of fruit. You still need to eat a lot of sweet potatoes or foods that fit in the paleo diet in order to fuel that training or that type of exercise. It wasn't about being low carb. It was about just cutting out some of these more processed foods. And I will say too, like, fortunately but unfortunately, the body will adapt to whatever you throw at it. So if you're chronically under eating carbs, your body will maybe not, it may be maladapted, but it will still adapt to that. And so you feel like you're still doing the training, you're still able to get up in the morning and do the workout, but you may feel like garbage the rest of the day. Or you're not actually progressing in your training. That's the one that I see the most often is like a lot of midlife women, they do the same workout 3 days a week at the gym, but they never actually progress in their weights. They never progress in their reps. They never progress in their jump height. And so without those carbs available to support the training, they're going to be able to still do the exercise, but they're not actually improving in any way.
So are there overall needs if somebody is primarily a resistance training athlete? Are their needs meaningfully different from an endurance athlete?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So
They are significantly different for a number of reasons, but there we maybe maybe this is my bias, but I think we know a lot more about fueling for endurance exercise because there's so much more research, like sports nutrition research on
Hmm.
athletes doing endurance sports than we do on strength-based athletes. But ultimately, like the training hours can be really high for somebody like a CrossFit athlete. I mean, some of these people are training 4 or 6 hours a day. But ultimately, the needs for somebody that's exercising 1 hour a day is not going to be the same as somebody that's exercising for 4 hours a day.
100%. 100%. I was just wondering if the carbohydrates skew or shift any way that we can cover as far as if somebody is doing mostly strength-based workouts 5 hours a week versus somebody who's doing mostly endurance-based workouts 5 hours a week.
Good question. Um, I'm going to say no,
Okay.
because first of all, even if you're doing strength-based training, it's still a metabolic window. There's still this window of time when your body is using those carbs in a different way than they are using them at rest. Um, Even though we're not burning as many carbs during the training for strength-based workouts, right? We're not using glycogen in the
Mm-hmm.
same way. It still increases our overall calorie needs for the day, and a big proportion of those ideally are coming from carbohydrates.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I want to touch a little bit on special circumstances, especially heat, because I think heat is so fascinating when it comes to carbohydrate intake, because there was some interesting research showing that we may burn less of the carbs that we take in and burn more of our own stores when exercising in the heat. And that seems to be a real conundrum.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you help people like fuel in the heat? Because that's a real thing. Like, trying to fuel in the heat is a whole other ball of wax.
Absolutely. And we know that women, like people with female reproductive organs, don't, uh, we have a higher basal metabolic temperature some of the time. And ultimately, we just have a harder time in the heat. So it's even more important as far as like prescription and recommendations to really focus on heat management
Mm.
as a performance indicator. So with carb availability, when we are in the heat, so ultimately what's happening is our core body temperature is going up, right?
Yep.
So if you're in the heat but you're really well acclimated and you have a high sweat rate and your body is able to keep its core body temperature down, that's not going to affect our carb availability in the same way as if we we're living in Alaska in the winter time and then did a race in Arizona
Right.
in the
Right.
spring.
Yeah.
So but it's not necessarily like the way I understand it is when we're in the heat, it raises our core body temperature, which can impact gut permeability. So, the ability of the carbs to get from the gut
Mm.
into the rest of the body. And so that makes us have low carb availability and requires then our bodies to produce the glucose our brain needs and our muscles need.
What do we do? Like, how do we handle that situation? I mean, is it
Yep.
just trying to keep as cool as you can? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. It's all about heat management strategies. So there's not like the things you can do are anything you can do to keep your core body
Mm.
temperature lower to then improve that gut permeability, improve that stress response. So things like drinking cold fluids will cool you from the inside is one of the most effective strategies. Dumping cold water on yourself and improving that evaporative cooling, wearing clothes that are allowing some of the sweat to come off your skin more quickly. One of the main tips I use for heat management is making sure that if you're outside, right? So this is relevant when you're outside, use a thin sunscreen rather than a really thick sunscreen. If you are doing a long duration activity or something where you're at risk for overheating. So
Hmm.
the thick sunscreen, like a thick cream, will create a barrier between your
Oh.
skin and the air, and that can
Mm-hmm.
trap the heat in and not allow it to dissipate.
Interesting. So that does also beg the question, what I'm curious about this in the heat and also your thoughts globally on this because a lot of people are trending towards high carbohydrate drinks now to fill a lot of their needs. And I ran into tremendous trouble with that when I raced Cape Epic and like drank 900 calories in the first hour because it was 96 degrees out. So I found that didn't work for me in the heat, though I can get away with that in the winter. Like, how do you coach people on like the source of their carbohydrates, and how do you use those high carb 300 calorie bottles, maybe even higher, some people are going,
Hmm.
and get high and manage hydration?
So the first thing I do is make sure that you are using the products as intended. So
Okay.
if a product says 1.5 scoops for a 500 milliliter bottle, do not put 3 scoops in there. Don't put five. It's intended to be 1.5 maximum, right? So each product, assuming they're well designed, is generally designed to be what's called isotonic, which allows it to get from the gut into the body efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have too many carbs or too many electrolytes per the amount of fluid, so water that you're taking in, this can throw off that balance. And the body actually then requires you to take water out of the body into the gut in order to digest it and get it into the rest of the body. So it's really important that you take in enough fluid, like enough water, with all the carbs and electrolytes you're taking in. So follow the recommendations on the package. If you are using a high carb drink mix, likely you're going to need to take in some plain water with it in order to digest it properly.
That has been my experience. That has been my what I try to do if I'm going to rely on, because some of them, I mean, they're intended to have 300 some calories in your bottle or whatever. You're putting multiple scoops in, but there's no way I can do that without having a bottle of plain water on me.
No, one thing I've picked up on recently is I've noticed a lot of athletes, and I actually personally struggle with this too, is like if you get like puffy fingers or you get like puffy in your face, a lot of the time that's because you're losing too much fluid to the amount of electrolytes.
Hmm.
So intuitively, you're like, I'm puffy, I need to take in less water. But actually, you need more water to um, extract the electrolytes.
It is such an ever shifting science experiment, isn't it? Because
Hmm.
there's so many factors going on, which is why people like you exist. I'm curious. Well, as we wrap up here, I had sent you a study and that I identified with quite a bit. Is that they were finding that people underestimated how many carbs they were taking in, and weren't hitting their marks, endurance athletes, and that came down to things like not timing it well, leaving food in the package, leaving gel in the package. Do you find any of that? Do you find that people hit their numbers when you're coaching them, or is that did that resonate with you at all?
Um, yes. Yeah, it did resonate. It's always nice when studies verify things that you already thought. So
Yeah.
it's like this is one of these validating studies for me personally, like in my practice. But yes, I do have plenty of athletes that overestimate the amount of gels or drink mix or overall carbs that they're intaking. I was curious. So in this study, one of the things I looked at is like, okay, are they asking people how many grams of carb they thought they took in? Or are they asking them how many gels, how much drink mix they
Mm,
took in? Because some people are like, oh, yeah, I took in 80, 90 grams of carb per hour. But then when you count up the gels, it's only like 40.
yeah.
But they did in this study actually ask them how many products they took. So they accounted for that.
Yeah.
But yes, I often see the discrepancy between the planned intake and the actual intake. And honestly, a lot of that has to do with logistics more than anything else. It's like we are intending to take in 2 gels and a bottle of drink mix per hour, but then we're in a race and our nerves are high and there's people around us and we forget. And it's more about training, like mental training and emotional like work, than it is, me telling somebody to eat 2 gels an hour.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the only way I really did just come down to, and it kind of worked to give my mind something to think about too. I'd be like, okay, every 20 minutes or when I get to a certain point, because when you're mountain bike racing, especially, it can be really hard to get anything into your system. But there would just be certain points. I'm like, I'm going to make sure I get calories here and calories here. It's not perfect, but it can be very easy to have 2 hours go by and your plan is just out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, mountain biking. I think the examples in these events were marathon racing,
Yeah.
road running marathon, and then a Grand Fondo. So a Grand Fondo, you're around other people you
Yep.
don't know. There's climbs, there's stops, there's all kinds of these like external factors influencing your ability to remember these things. But really, it's about building habits and experience. So when in your body during training sessions, you always take something in 20 minutes, something in your brain is going to tell you you need that.
Right. Right.
And then also doing mental training, like working with a mental coach to help set you up for success in that new environment you may not be in very often, like with an event.
Interesting. And finally, because when you were talking about marathoning and fondos, those are two very different things. Runners obviously have harder times. Are there carbohydrate training, gut training, specific recommendations that you give for people who are primarily runners to help with that issue of digestion and all the things that they run into?
Yep. The recommendations themselves are the same. So we need to take in the same amount of carbs, the same amount of fluids, the same amount of electrolytes. So the body's needs aren't any different. But when I'm working with a runner, I think a primary factor is you can't get behind on fuel in running. Cycling, you might be behind in 1 hour going up a climb, but you can kind of make it up on the descent or in a flat section, and you're going to have time to digest. You're going to be able to get it in. But in a running event, you're going all out the whole time. Like there's no capacity. So it's super important to take in small amounts often in order to like allow for that food and those nutrients to digest, hit your bloodstream, and not cause a gut bomb that you're going to get at mile 5, mile 10.
Yep. Very good advice. And practice that. I was always very guilty of that. I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to go out for my ride. And I like that kind of practice. And I hadn't even put together the mental part, but it does make a difference. Like if you're used to doing it, it becomes habitual. And then you don't have to think about it as much when you're actually in your event because it's just something you do. Yeah, I like that. Is there anything that we have not talked about as we come to a close here, Kristen, that people should think about as they are thinking about their carbohydrate intake and their fueling for the new year?
I think the primary message from me is just to understand like carbs are a vital nutrient for our bodies. Like they are not only important for making sure we're having optimal training and performance and ultimately going to support those goals, but also our like mental health and acuity, our overall quality of life. And remembering too that carbohydrate rich foods have a lot of nutrients in them. I think that's one thing we didn't touch on is like when we're cutting down on carbs, we're also cutting down on fiber. We're cutting down on both prebiotic rich foods that are helping our gut health. We're cutting down on the amount of minerals and vitamins our body can get. And so by like cutting down on these really valuable foods, we are depriving our bodies of these other nutrients that we could get.
Yeah. Yeah, very important. And all of that for midlife and beyond is just, it's so important. So I'm glad that you are here singing the praises of carbs coming into the new year. And thanks for, as always, for your expertise.
Yes, thanks for having me. Excited to be on here again.
Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with pharmacist and expert perimenopause nutritionist Sarah Gray, author of It's Not You, It's Perimenopause. We talk all about hormone therapy, supplements, nutritional needs in midlife and menopause and the menopause transition, and much, much, much more. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.